Yo, YouTube, what is going on? We are back with Rostermania 2.0 predictions. Basically everything we know so far, which is a lot at this point, thanks to CDL Intel and all the leaks that have been coming out lately. And we're going to be predicting these final rosters now that actually these pieces are falling into place. It's going to be an insane one. Obviously, lately there's been tons of news on the fronts of Gunless, Priestahh, what's happening with Seattle and Octane, what's going down with Attach and like Priestahh, what's happening with all those guys. We're talking about that today and finally deciding where these guys are going to Rostermania. Without further ado, let's get right into it. Let's go. So from the last updates we got, this is where we left off. We had the locked rosters of Empire, FaZe, and Huntsmen. Basically feels like a guarantee at this point that those are going to be the rosters. We got Dashy on the Huntsmen. Arcitys and Prestinni were released from the Huntsmen, and from everything we've heard, Arcitys is headed towards FaZe. The question marks with Prestinni kind of remain, and the London Royal Ravens are still up in turmoil with who is going to be going there. We have OpTic, who's going to be there fourth, we're not sure. And then we have the Toronto, the Mutineers, and the Subliners rosters, which were still up in the air at that point. Then we have Paris and Rokkr. Basically, we all thought that was going to be a weird wash. And then LAG has Vivid, Seattle has Octane. The question is, what has changed? So the Ultra dropped their whole roster except for these four. And as far as we know right now, this is going to be their roster. I'm pretty confident that this is going to happen. So I feel like we can put a little lock sign next to them as well. The only reported potential option that CDL Intel said they might have is that they potentially might bring Insight in as a substitute here, as the fifth substitute. So Insight, who was a Singularity guy, played with Phoenix in their dominant runs in BO4. That could be an awesome addition as a substitute for Toronto. I think would make a lot of sense as a two-way player for them on their organization and being their sub at the same time. So a ton of drama has happened since the last time we talked about New York and these roster predictions. We knew for a fact now that Attach and Temp were sent to the waiver wire. So we're left with this potential core three, but we don't know for a fact about Attach, and he's a little bit of a wild card right now with what might happen. It seems like a trade might be in the works and how that potentially could play out, but there's still some question marks there overall with CDL Intel. They are convinced that Priestahh is heading to the New York Subliners to be their main AR on that roster. There's a pretty high probability that this could happen. There's a chance Attach might find his way somewhere else, and we'll talk about that in a second. But for now, let's leave him on New York, and we'll come back to that later. So again, last time we talked again, the Mutineers, we had like no information about this team and what could potentially be happening. Now at this point, it feels like Skies and Awakening are a lock to be in the roster. Fero is still a question mark where he could potentially end up, and Frosty took the Mutineers out of his bio. It seems like Frosty is done in Florida. So when it comes to Fero, some people think that he might end up on the New York Subliners replacing Attach. If Attach can find his spot on the one of these three rosters, with Attach being one of the key pieces to the Rokkr's new roster. So what makes this roster really interesting is the other rumored players there right now are Accuracy, Major Maniac, and Attach. He's been the big piece that we've been trying to figure out where Attach might be going. So I'll throw these guys in here real quick, but Accuracy, Priestahh, and Major Maniac are rumored to be the New York Subliners roster, and that is a star-studded lineup for the Rokkr. The roles are a little concerning in my opinion for this team. I mean, you got Attach, Priestahh, and Major Maniac, who all in their time have been good SMGs, but have flexed at times as well. Depending on the meta for this game, if it's a 2AR, 2 SMG meta, it could definitely work. It seems to still be up in the air whether or not Attach is going to be heading to the Rokkr or not, depending on how these dominoes fall with a potential trade in the works. Because if he doesn't go there, that probably means that Attach heads back to the Subliners, and then Fero ends up back on the Mutineers. But as far as we know, this seems pretty likely, and I think I might go with it right now as the prediction for a final outcome right now. So the Seattle situation is definitely juicy. Obviously, like I said, Seattle dropped everybody except for Octane at this point. The only guy that we've heard news on from that roster is Apathy. Potentially might be finding his way onto the LA Gorillas, which we'll talk about more in a second. It's definitely interesting. It feels like a Rise Nation 2.0 because the rumor right now from CDL Intel, who said he's been here in Gunless, is likely going to Seattle to pair with Octane, which is exciting to say the least. And potentially that means as well that Prestinni could find his way onto Seattle to pair with that duo. And the other rumor is that Looney could find his way there as well, which again, you know, Gunless talked about Looney before, about how much he loves teaming with him and how much he loved teaming with him on Rise. In a way, this roster feels like a Rise 2.0 because the original Rise roster was Gunless, Looney, Tej, and Slasher. So you replace Slasher for Octane and you replace Tej for Prestinni. This could work potentially, depending on how good Looney can still be. I think this roster could be extremely interesting. At the end of the day, having Gunless and Octane on any team together is definitely a little intimidating. And then you have a really aggro SMG in Prestinni. You've got the smart and methodical player in Looney. It's a really interesting combo if the game's meta suits him pretty well. And based on what we've been seeing today, I think it might. So again, what CDL Intel is hearing about LAG, who would join Vivid and Apathy in LA? And it sounds like the Rokkr duo of Silly and Assault might be the answer. It's definitely a little weird and unusual roster. Definitely not one that I would have thought would happen, like heading into Rostermania with a Vivid, Apathy, Silly, Assault squad here. But right off the rip, my initial instinct says they're definitely on the lower half of an initial mid-Rostermania power rankings. So now we've got the two European rosters to talk about before we talk more about OpTic Gaming and the Mutineers. Originally, we thought that Shawnee was for sure getting the cut with the rest of the squad after we heard that from like Wuskins and Skrapz. What happened is that he was actually re-signed right away, which is extremely interesting. I was a little surprised for sure when I heard the news at first, because we still don't know for a fact where Wuskin and Skrapz could end up. So one name that CDL Intel is pretty confident about that's heading to London is Alexx. And this isn't any massive surprise. Obviously, he's from the UK himself. Of course, that duo team back in World War II on Unilad, who was a fairly successful team during the year, but they never made any like big splashes, mostly in World War II. CDL Intel's been hearing Dylan as a third, and the fourth seems to be like a question mark right now. He's not convinced that Dylan is set to go there right now either. I still think that makes a lot of sense overall, where you pair Alexx and Dylan together as SMGs. You have Shawnee, who can flex but probably run the main AR, and then you bring in another flex to fill in that fourth. I think there's a lot of different options who that could be. We'll leave it blank for now and then go back and talk about a prediction here in a second. So Paris's roster is a little weird as well, because they're going into the amateur scene to find some of these guys, and I think it makes a lot of sense overall though. So the first guy that it looks like they're targeting is Pred, the Australian, the absolute beast on Renegades this last season. They went on like a 1,000 tournament win streak in Australia. They were on fire. Most AMs would say that Pred has the chance to be an insane player, and it'd be a pretty exciting risk for Paris to take with a guy like that. But the upside is definitely there for a really fun roster. The other player that CDL Intel says they're looking at is Hydra, the French kind of phenom who like teamed with like Whalers and Brezzy this year on Train Hard Esports, the European AMP scene. People have seen him as an up and coming AM for a while now, and he had a really good year this year. And I could definitely see him finding his way onto that Paris Legion squad, which only makes sense as a hometown French player for the squad. It makes a lot of sense overall. He's not exactly sure who could potentially get re-signed from Paris, potentially Dens and potentially Zed, which I think would be a pretty reasonable starting roster to have heading into a 4v4 game, to say the least. So this is what that roster would look like right there with Paris. So now we're having to talk about the Mutineers. We need to talk about OpTic's fourth, and we need to talk about the London Royal Ravens fourth. The Mutineers are a tough case if they end up losing out on Fero. I could see a world where John reunites with Skies from the LG connection, and that could happen. So you have Skies, you have Awakening, you have John. So as for Florida's fourth, there's a lot of options this could potentially be. Maybe you see a world where Havoc ends up coming back, and then that's the fourth, and so then you have John plus Havoc. I could potentially see the world where they're interested in like someone like Skrapz to come in and be their fourth as an SMG, maybe like Isim or maybe like Hollow, but I'd be a little bit surprised. I also think there's a world where Awakening pulls some strings and gets one of his 6 gear guys onto this team. I could see like Spoof, Zaptius, or Gintroid having a chance to get onto this team, but it would be a little bit surprising. So I'm gonna take the chance that John ends up joining this team. And then the fourth, man. So for the fun of it, I'm going to full send with Skrapz on the Mutineers, but I'm not convinced that's going to happen. It could easily end up being one of those 6 gear guys from the amateur scene, or like a Sim or Hollow or something like that in another weird roster. So as for OpTic Gaming, CDL Intel thought that Drazah could potentially end up being their fourth if other things don't end up going their way. The rumor was originally that Priestahh was trying to find his way onto OpTic, and then things somehow must have fallen apart or didn't go as like the way that Priestahh wanted them to go, or something along those lines. For some reason that fell apart. Then there was rumors that potentially Gunless could find himself there as the fourth, which I mean, the talent on that roster is just crazy. Again, like that is like TK 2.0 as well. I would love to see it, but it is a little weird. I think at the end of the day, the most likely option is that Drazah ends up being their fourth. No, they settle with Drazah. That seems like the most likely outcome. So that's what I'm gonna end up predicting for now as well. It's not as exciting as I would like it, but maybe there's a world where John could be the fourth. But I want to keep my eye on that OpTic situation, because I feel like it's a pretty desirable like situation and like location for players, and I'd be surprised if they can't convince somebody else to get there. Maybe you see someone like Skrapz finding their way onto that team, that's possible as well. So the fourth is really tough. There's so many options for this guy. I think it's going to end up being an AM player, potentially someone like on Team War. I'm just going to insert Team War here. Like Dave, Vortex, or like Afro are all potential options. I think would make a lot of sense. Afro's been so hyped in the community the past like year or so. I wouldn't be surprised to take a chance on a guy like that, especially with it being an online season. I think this is where we're probably at right now. We got those 4 rosters that are basically locks at this point, and then the rest look like they might be sorting out like that. It is definitely a wild time, man. I am excited. I cannot be more excited for Rostermania, and I can't wait to see how these guys end up finishing this year out. It's going to be a blast, and I could not be more excited. So if you guys enjoyed the video, drop your comments down below. Where do you guys think these players are ending up, and what I get right, what I get wrong? I know you guys got your opinions down below, but as always, guys, I really do appreciate you guys tuning in. Like, comment, subscribe if you enjoyed the video. Share it if you guys really enjoyed it. But as always, guys, I'm your boy FaZe, and we will see you next time. I'm out.